Somewhere beneath the ancient streets of Alexandria, Egypt, lie the echoes of a place that once held the accumulated wisdom of the entire known world. Scholars travelled months across deserts and seas just to stand within its walls and breathe the same air as history's greatest minds. It was a building that contained secrets about the stars, the shape of the earth, the nature of the human body, and the origins of civilization itself. Then, slowly, inexplicably, it vanished, and with it, an unknowable number of ideas, discoveries, and stories that the world has never recovered. For more than 2,000 years, historians have argued, debated, and wondered how something so magnificent could simply cease to exist. Tonight, we follow the long and haunting story of the Library of Alexandria. What it was, what it held, and what the world lost when the last flame went dark. Welcome back, dear friends, to Whispered Empires, your sanctuary for slow, immersive journeys through the ancient world. Tonight, we travel to the shores of Egypt, where a dream of knowledge once burned as brightly as any lighthouse flame. Before we begin, we would love to know, what time is it where you are right now, and where in the world are you watching from? Leave it in the comments below, and we are curious. If you could recover one lost piece of ancient knowledge, what would you choose to find? If these quiet journeys through history help you rest, please like and subscribe. Now, settle in, close your eyes if you wish, and let history carry you gently to sleep. Chapter 1. A city born from a conqueror's dream. Long before the great library rose above the Mediterranean shore, there was a young king moving through the ancient world like a slow tide, reshaping everything in his path. Alexander III of Macedon, born in 346 BC, had inherited his father Philip's throne at just 20 years of age. By 30, he had forged one of history's vastest empires, stretching from the sun-warmed hills of Greece to the distant edges of northwestern India, never once losing a battle. In the autumn of 332 BC, Alexander turned his gaze toward Egypt. His great victory over the Persian king Darius III at the Battle of Issus the year before had cracked the spine of Persian power. Now, following the hard sieges of Tyre and Gaza along the eastern Mediterranean coast, his army moved southward through the dry, golden air of late season toward the ancient land of the Nile, where an entire civilization waited beneath the weight of Persian occupation. Egypt received him not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. For generations, the Egyptian people had endured two harsh periods of Persian rule, marked by impiety toward their sacred temples and oppressive governance. When Alexander arrived, the Persian satrap Mouseion offered no resistance, surrendering the treasury and royal furnishings without battle. All across the ancient land, city after city simply opened its arms. Alexander had entered a world already weary of its chains, and he moved through it like cool water through cracked earth. To establish himself within the ancient pharaonic tradition, Alexander performed the sacred rites expected of a true ruler of Egypt. At Memphis, the ancient capital, he offered sacrifices to Apis and the great Egyptian gods. He was crowned pharaoh, receiving the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, and was proclaimed the living incarnation of Ra and Osiris. These were not merely political gestures. Alexander moved through these ceremonies with the quiet sincerity of someone who understood that lasting power is born not from conquest alone, but from belonging. Yet it was not only Memphis that called to Alexander. Deep in the western desert, far beyond the familiar comfort of the Nile Valley, lay the Siwa oasis, home to the ancient oracle of Amun. Greek travelers had long known of this sacred place. For Alexander, it held something irresistible: the promise of divine confirmation. He traveled hundreds of miles across treacherous desert terrain, reportedly guided by birds along the shifting sands, to stand before the god's appointed voice in that remote and breathless sanctuary. At the temple of Amun in Siwa, the high priest greeted Alexander with words that would echo through centuries. According to Plutarch, what was meant as the Greek phrase meaning, "O my son," emerged, through either mispronunciation or divine intention, as "O Son of God." The oracle declared Alexander the son of Amun. In a single moment, a Macedonian king became a divinely ordained pharaoh in the eyes of both Egyptians and Greeks. The secret pronouncements made that day died with Alexander, and they have never been recovered. With divine legitimacy now woven into his name, Alexander turned his attention to legacy. In 331 BC, he chose a site on Egypt's northwestern coast, a narrow strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and the freshwater lake Mareotis, where the village of Rakotis had quietly existed for generations. The location offered dual natural harbours, protection from the Nile's floods, and a position at the crossroads of Europe, Africa, and Asia. It was a place, as Greek seers foretold, destined to become large, prosperous, and a source of enduring wealth. The man entrusted to give Alexander's vision its lasting physical form was Dinocrates of Rhodes, a distinguished Greek architect trained in the school of Hippodamus, the father of urban planning. Alexander himself is said to have drawn the city's first outlines in the sand. Wide streets angled to receive natural breezes, grand avenues broad enough for 8 lanes of horses, designated spaces for markets and temples, honoring both Greek and Egyptian gods. Dinocrates then translated this dream into the formal geometry of a true Hellenistic city. Alexander departed Egypt in 331 BC, returning to his campaigns against Persia, never to see his city completed. He died in Babylon in June of 323 BC at only 32 years of age after a 12-day fever. His death unleashed a long storm. His generals, the Diadochi, meaning the successors, turned upon one another in decades of shifting alliances and devastating wars. The vast empire he had forged began, slowly and painfully, to break apart like ancient stone worn smooth by wind and time. Among the generals who fought for their share of the empire was Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most trusted companions since childhood. He and Alexander had studied together under Aristotle, grown into soldiers together, and shared a bond of loyalty that stretched across decades of campaign. At the partition of Babylon, Ptolemy was formally appointed satrap of Egypt. He moved swiftly, intercepted Alexander's body as it traveled toward Macedonia, and brought it to rest in Memphis, later to be enshrined in Alexandria itself, a gesture that bound his rule to the sacred memory of the fallen king. In the years that followed, Ptolemy secured Egypt through careful strategy, defeated the regent Perdiccas at the Nile frontier, and quietly built his legitimacy among both Greeks and Egyptians alike. He adopted the double title of pharaoh and king, had himself carved in traditional Egyptian dress upon temple walls, and created the syncretic god Serapis to unite both peoples in shared devotion. Around 305 BC, he crowned himself king, founding the Ptolemaic dynasty that would endure for nearly 3 centuries. With Ptolemy's vision now firmly planted on the shores of the Mediterranean, the work of building the most extraordinary institution the ancient world had ever known was about to begin. Chapter 2. The House of the Muses. Building the greatest library on earth. In the ancient Greek tradition, the 9 Muses were daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne, the goddess of memory. They presided over poetry, history, astronomy, and all the arts of the mind. A place built in their honor was called a Mouseion, a seat of the Muses, a sanctuary where human thought could draw near to something divine. It was from this sacred idea that one of the most remarkable institutions in all of human history would eventually take form, beside the shimmering waters of the Mediterranean. Around 300 BCE, in the great city of Alexandria on the Egyptian coast, Ptolemy I Soter received a vision. Not a divine one, but a practical and ambitious one. A scholar named Demetrius of Phalerum, once a statesman of Athens who had found refuge at the Ptolemaic court, proposed the creation of a universal institution of learning. Ptolemy I conceived the idea and laid its foundations. It would fall to his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, to bring that vision fully into being, constructing the Mouseion within the royal quarter of the city. The Mouseion rose within the Mouseion, the royal quarter of Alexandria, close beside the palace complex and the great harbour. Its architecture breathed the spirit of Athens. Colonnaded walkways called peripatos, where scholars could stroll and think. A great semicircular exedra, fitted with tiered stone benches for lectures and gatherings, and a communal dining hall where resident scholars shared meals and conversation. Gardens and shaded groves surrounded the buildings, evoking the sacred landscapes traditionally associated with the Muses themselves. Within this living community, resident scholars received salaries from the Ptolemaic state, lived in comfortable quarters, and were freed from taxation. More than 100 scholars from across the Greek world gathered here during the institution's early expansion under Ptolemy II. They dined together each evening, exchanging ideas across mathematics, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, and literature. At the heart of this great complex, integrated within its halls, stood the library itself, its shelves bearing an inscription that read, "The place of the cure of the soul, Ptolemy II." Philadelphus pursued the scrolls of the world with extraordinary determination. Royal envoys were dispatched to Athens, Rhodes, and cities across the Mediterranean to purchase and exchange manuscripts. A powerful navy and merchant fleet carried shipments of texts back to Alexandria. By some accounts, any ship docking in Alexandria's harbour was required to surrender its books for copying, the originals kept and copies returned to their owners. Through diplomacy, wealth, and strategic acquisition, the shelves of the library began to fill with the knowledge of many civilizations. Among the most remarkable acts of acquisition involved a famed collection of scrolls borrowed from Athens. The Ptolemaic court secured the originals against a substantial deposit of silver, a sum so large it astonished observers. The scrolls were brought to Alexandria, copied with great care by the library's scribes, and the originals were never returned. The deposit was forfeited. The episode illustrated, quietly but clearly, how much the ancient world valued these fragile rolls of papyrus, each one equivalent in content to a small modern book, holding tens of thousands of words within its length. The collection that gathered in Alexandria was breathtaking in its diversity. Greek philosophy, poetry, mathematics, and medicine filled the shelves alongside Babylonian astronomical texts and the sacred scriptures of other traditions. Among the most significant additions was the Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures commissioned during the reign of Ptolemy II. 72 Jewish scholars traveled from Jerusalem to Alexandria, where they rendered the Torah into Greek, creating the earliest known translation of the Hebrew Bible, a work that would echo through centuries of religious history. Ancient sources claim the library held between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls at its height, though modern scholars regard those figures with caution. More careful assessments grounded in the library's physical storage capacity and comparative evidence suggest a collection of perhaps 40,000 to 100,000 scrolls, still a staggering accumulation for the ancient world. A secondary collection was also established across the city at the Great Temple of Serapis, the Serapeum, which held approximately 42,000 scrolls and served as a public annex of the main library. To manage a collection of such scale, a scholar named Callimachus of Cyrene undertook one of the most ambitious intellectual projects of the ancient world. Working during the reign of Ptolemy II, he created the Pinaques, a catalogue of Greek literature spanning 120 papyrus rolls. Organized into genres such as epic poetry, tragedy, comedy, philosophy, and history, the Pinaques listed each work alphabetically by author, including biographical details, opening lines, and notes on authenticity. It was the first systematic library catalogue in Western history, and the ancestor of every library index that followed. The library was led through the generations by a succession of distinguished scholars appointed by the Ptolemaic kings. Zenodotus of Ephesus, the first head librarian, produced authoritative editions of Homer and introduced alphabetical organization. After him came Apollonius of Rhodes, tutor to a future king and author of the epic Argonautica. Then Eratosthenes, who calculated the circumference of the earth. Then Aristophanes of Byzantium, who invented Greek punctuation. Each librarian was a towering mind in his own right, and together they shaped the institution into something the ancient world had never seen before. By drawing together scholars, texts, and ideas from across the Mediterranean and beyond, the Mouseion and its great library gradually transformed Alexandria into the intellectual capital of the ancient world. Greek philosophy rested beside Babylonian astronomy. Hebrew scripture had been rendered into Greek. The mathematics of the East met the philosophy of Athens within the same colonnaded halls. A quiet city beside the sea had become the living memory of civilization itself. As the shelves of the great library filled with the wisdom of the world, the minds who gathered within its walls began producing ideas that would echo through all of human history. Chapter 3: Minds that Changed the World. The Scholars of Alexandria. Within the quiet halls of the Mouseion, scholars lived a life unlike any other in the ancient world. They gathered each morning in a great communal hall, sharing meals and ideas beneath colonnaded walkways. The Ptolemaic kings provided them salaries, servants, and freedom from taxation, asking only that they think, discover, and teach. Some 30 to 100 resident scholars dwelled there at any given time, moving between private study rooms, lecture halls, and gardens. It was a sanctuary of the mind where the rhythms of daily life were shaped entirely by curiosity. Among the earliest and most enduring figures to emerge from Alexandria was Euclid, a Greek mathematician who flourished around 300 BC. He is thought to have been educated in the tradition of Plato's academy in Athens before traveling to Alexandria, where he joined the faculty of the Mouseion under the patronage of Ptolemy I. Euclid's name has been synonymous ever since with the study of geometry. When Ptolemy himself once asked whether there was a faster road to learning geometry, Euclid replied simply that there was no royal road. Rigorous thought, he believed, admitted no shortcuts. Euclid's great work, The Elements, was a 13-book treatise that gathered and systematized the mathematical knowledge of the Greek world. Beginning from simple definitions and postulates, it built outward through logical deduction into proofs of extraordinary complexity. It covered geometry, number theory, the Pythagorean theorem, the infinite nature of prime numbers, and the volumes of cones and spheres. Many of the proofs were Euclid's own. The Elements would become the most widely studied mathematical text in history, taught as a foundation of learning for more than 2,000 years. Its influence stretching from medieval Islamic schools to the universities of Renaissance Europe. A generation later, a man of extraordinary range arrived in Alexandria from Cyrene on the northern coast of Africa. His name was Eratosthenes, born around 276 BC. He would serve as chief librarian of the Library of Alexandria, entrusted with acquiring every text that passed through the city's harbour. Scribes would copy incoming scrolls, returning the originals to their owners while keeping the copies for the library's collection. Eratosthenes held this position until his death around 194 BC, and also served as royal tutor to Ptolemy IV. His access to the library's vast knowledge would prove essential to the work that would make him immortal. Eratosthenes accomplished something remarkable. He measured the circumference of the entire Earth using nothing more than shadows, geometry, and careful reasoning. He observed that at noon on the summer solstice, the sun shone directly down a deep well in Syene, with no shadow, while in Alexandria a vertical stick cast a measurable shadow of about 7 degrees. Using trained walkers who measured the distance between the two cities as approximately 5,000 stadia, he applied a simple proportion. Multiplying by 50, he arrived at a total circumference of roughly 40,000 kilometers, a figure differing from the modern accepted value by only about 2%. Eratosthenes did not stop at measuring the Earth. He founded the modern discipline of geography, coining the very terms geography and geographer. He drew the first systematic world map using a network of parallels and meridians. He correctly traced the course of the Nile to Khartoum, identifying its seasonal flooding as the result of heavy rains at its distant source, the first essentially accurate explanation of this ancient mystery. He compiled a star catalogue, devised a calendar incorporating leap years, and created the sieve of Eratosthenes, an elegant algorithm for identifying prime numbers. His was a mind that moved fluidly across every boundary of human knowledge. Among the scholars connected to Alexandria's intellectual world was Aristarchus of Samos, born around 310 BC. He proposed something that would not be accepted for nearly 2 millennia, that the sun, not the earth, stood at the center of the cosmos. In his model, the Earth rotated on its axis daily and completed a full orbit around the Sun each year. He also suspected that the distant stars were other suns, far removed. His contemporaries rejected the idea. It conflicted with Aristotelian physics, with everyday experience, and with the deeply held belief that Earth occupied a unique and central place in a finite universe. The library also sheltered physicians who pushed the boundaries of human knowledge in a different direction. Herophilus of Alexandria, born around 330 BC, and Erasistratus, born around 304 BC, conducted the first systematic dissections of the human body in recorded history. Working under the permissive patronage of the Ptolemaic court, they identified the brain as the center of sensation and thought, distinguished nerve from blood vessels, and mapped the liver, uterus, pancreas, and spleen with remarkable precision. Their work laid the foundations of neuroscience and anatomy. Ancient sources, including the Roman author Celsus, also alleged that they performed vivisections on condemned criminals, a claim that generated profound ethical controversy across centuries. Not all of Alexandria's great minds pursued the purely scientific. Apollonius of Rhodes, a poet and scholar who worked at the library during the 3rd century BC, composed the Argonautica, an epic poem retelling the voyage of Jason and the Argonauts in their quest for the Golden Fleece. It was one of the only complete Hellenistic epics to survive antiquity. Apollonius wove geography, mythology, and the psychology of love into his verse, depicting the sorceress Medea with an interiority that anticipated the later Romance tradition. His work served Ptolemaic Alexandria as a kind of cultural archive, celebrating myth and identity in a city that stood at the crossroads of many worlds. Later, in the 1st century AD, a Greek engineer named Heron of Alexandria gave the world devices that seemed to belong to a different age entirely. He built the Aeolipile, a sphere that rotated when heated by steam, the first known steam turbine in history. He designed automated theatre machines, coin-operated dispensing devices, surveying instruments, and hydraulic mechanisms. He formulated Heron's formula for calculating the area of a triangle and developed methods for approximating square roots. Heron's work was preserved in large part through Arabic manuscripts, eventually reaching the scholars of the medieval Islamic world and, through them, the engineers of the European Renaissance. Among the last great figures of Alexandria's classical tradition was Hypatia, born sometime between 350 and 370 AD. Daughter of the mathematician Theon, she led the Neoplatonic school of Alexandria, teaching mathematics, astronomy, geometry, and philosophy to students both pagan and Christian. She was respected by the city's political elite and maintained close ties with Orestes, the Roman prefect. In March 415 AD, she was killed by a Christian mob amid a bitter feud between civic and religious authorities. Her death marked a quiet, sorrowful turning point, the dimming of a long light. Yet even as these brilliant minds transformed our understanding of the world, the forces of history were already gathering. Forces that would one day cast a long shadow over everything the library had built. Chapter 4. Caesar's fire, the first wound. In the autumn of 48 BC, Egypt was quietly unraveling. Ptolemy II had died some years before, leaving his throne to two young heirs, his daughter Cleopatra VII, then 17, and his son Ptolemy XIII, barely 10 years old. From the beginning, the court's powerful ministers sought to marginalize Cleopatra, erasing her name from official documents and striking her image from coins, slowly and deliberately pushing her toward exile. Cleopatra was no passive figure. She learned the Egyptian language, presented herself as the living incarnation of Isis, and spent generously to win popular devotion. Yet the court's forces against her proved stronger. By the spring of 48 BC, she was forced to flee into Syria. There she gathered soldiers of her own and returned, and open civil war broke out across Egypt, a kingdom fracturing along the fault lines of its own restless ambitions. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, Rome's own civil war had reached its turning point. At Pharsalus, Julius Caesar had defeated Pompey the Great, and Pompey fled east seeking refuge. He turned to Egypt, trusting in old alliances. But Ptolemy XIII's advisors, calculating, cold-blooded, saw an opportunity rather than an obligation. As Pompey stepped ashore at Pelusium, he was murdered. His severed head was preserved and waiting when Caesar's fleet arrived in Alexandria's harbour in October of 48 BC. Caesar arrived not in triumph, but in complexity. He had come to pursue a rival and found a kingdom already at war with itself. Ptolemy's advisors had hoped to earn his favour with Pompey's death. Caesar, by some accounts, was saddened by his former son-in-law's fate. Yet he remained in Alexandria, drawn into the dynastic struggle, and driven by practical needs. Egypt owed Rome considerable debts, and Caesar intended to collect. Cleopatra, still exiled, recognized that Caesar represented her only real path back to power. The details of how she reached him have passed into legend, smuggled into the palace wrapped in cloth, or carried by trusted servants past enemy lines. Whatever the precise truth, she reached Caesar privately, and the two formed an alliance as much political as personal. She sought Rome's military support. He sought Egypt's considerable wealth. Each intended to use the other. The alliance between Caesar and Cleopatra enraged Ptolemy XIII's advisors. The general Achillas marched on Alexandria with roughly 20,000 soldiers. Caesar, caught with only a fraction of that force, perhaps 3,000 infantry, retreated into the fortified royal quarter. The city sealed around him. Food and water grew scarce. The Egyptians fortified the streets, armed freed slaves, and prepared to eliminate the Roman presence entirely from their ancient city. To prevent the Egyptian fleet from cutting off any possibility of relief or retreat, Caesar made a swift and consequential decision. He ordered his soldiers to set fire to the warships and vessels lying in the harbour dockyards. Caesar himself recorded this in his account of the Civil War, the Bellum Civile, describing the fire as a military necessity. He makes no mention of any library. The flames consumed the ships and, carried by the wind, spread toward the rooftops of nearby buildings along the harbour's edge. The fire that spread from the harbour reached buildings near the docks. Ancient sources, written decades later, speak of scrolls lost in the blaze. The Roman historian Livy, whose account survives through quotations by Seneca, recorded that some 40,000 books perished, describing their loss as a striking calamity. Yet what exactly burned remained contested even in antiquity. Cassius Dio, writing later still, described damage to warehouses near the docks, where grain and books were stored, not the great library itself. Scholars have noted that Alexandria's main library and Mouseion complex occupied the royal quarter, physically separated from the commercial harbour district. The core library buildings were masonry structures, deliberately set apart from the flammable wooden wharves. What burned near the docks likely included peripheral warehouses holding newly acquired scrolls, books seized from incoming ships awaiting cataloguing, and overflow storage. Real losses, certainly, but the great institution itself may have remained largely intact. The Alexandrian War continued into 47 BC, when relief forces arrived from Syria under Mithridates of Pergamum. The combined Roman and allied armies met Ptolemy's forces at the Battle of the Nile. Ptolemy II drowned in the fighting. The siege was broken. Caesar emerged victorious, and Cleopatra was restored to her throne alongside her younger brother. Years later, Mark Antony would reportedly gift Cleopatra some 200,000 scrolls from the Library of Pergamum. Perhaps an effort to replenish what Caesar's fire had diminished. Strabo visited Alexandria around 20 BC, more than 2 decades after Caesar's fire. He found the Mouseion still standing, still functioning, though diminished in its former glory. The library had endured, though wounded. The fire had not erased it in a single night. Modern scholars conclude that the events of 48 BC destroyed peripheral warehouses, not the library's heart. Caesar's fire left a wound, real, undeniable, but not a death blow. Though Caesar's fire left its mark on Alexandria's memory, the library's deeper wounds would come not from a single night of flames, but from the slow erosion of centuries that followed. Chapter 5. Centuries of silence, war, religion, and slow decline. When Alexandria passed into Roman hands in 30 BC, something quietly shifted. The city remained grand, its streets still wide and luminous, its harbour still busy with ships. Yet the deep current of royal patronage that had sustained the library and the Mouseion for generations had slowed to a trickle. Roman rulers valued Egypt for its grain, not its scholars. The generous stipends that had once drawn the finest minds of the ancient world gradually diminished, and the institution that had defined human knowledge began its long, unhurried drift toward silence. Even before Rome's full dominion, the fires of civil war had already touched the library. In 48 BC, as Julius Caesar fought to secure Cleopatra's throne against her brother, Roman forces set fire to the ships and wharves of Alexandria's harbour. The flames spread. Ancient writers disagreed on how much was lost. Seneca recorded that 40,000 scrolls perished, while others claimed the entire library burned. What is known is that the library survived in some diminished form, perhaps rebuilt in part. Its collection wounded but not yet extinguished. Life within the Mouseion continued, though its character slowly transformed. The geographer Strabo visited around 20 BC and recorded the institution's activities. Emperor Claudius, ruling in the 1st century AD, even funded a new extension to the library's buildings. Yet beneath these surface gestures, the institution's soul was fading. Membership in the Mouseion, once reserved for the greatest scholars of the age, was increasingly granted as a political reward, given to athletes, military officers, and government officials, rather than to those who had devoted their lives to learning. The scholar Didymus Chalcenterus, working in Alexandria during the late 1st century BC, produced an astonishing 4,000 volumes, the most extensive literary output of any known ancient writer. His tireless work was a testament to what the library's collections still made possible. Yet even such extraordinary productivity could not conceal the deeper truth. The prestige of Alexandrian scholarship was quietly diminishing. By the 2nd century AD, the very word Alexandrian had begun to carry a faint shadow of criticism. A reputation for careful editing and textual commentary rather than original and daring thought. A decisive blow came in the early 3rd century AD. Emperor Caracalla, ruling between 211 and 217 AD, suspended the Mouseion's revenues entirely, abolished scholars' stipends, and expelled foreign residents from Alexandria. These acts struck at the very heart of the institution's ability to sustain itself. Talent could no longer be attracted or retained. The ancient gathering place of the world's finest minds was stripped of the resources that had made it extraordinary. References to the Mouseion functioning as a living institution cease entirely in the historical record by the 260s AD. Then came Queen Zenobia of Palmyra. Around 270 AD, this formidable ruler launched a military campaign into Egypt, and her general Zabda seized Alexandria. Zenobia declared herself Queen of Egypt, issuing coins bearing her portrait alongside the image of Selene, deliberately invoking the memory of Cleopatra to legitimize her rule. For a brief moment, Alexandria found itself the jewel of a breakaway empire stretching across Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. But this interlude was short-lived. The Roman Emperor Aurelian, determined to reunite the fractured empire, turned his attention westward toward Alexandria. In 272 AD, Emperor Aurelian retook Alexandria by force. His troops stormed and destroyed the Mouseion, the ancient royal quarter of the city, the very district where the great library and Mouseion had long stood. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus recorded the devastation plainly. Alexandria lost the greater part of the district called Bruchion. The destruction was so thorough that the royal quarter was no longer even considered part of the city proper. It became a suburb, then a wasteland. Nearly a century later, in 392 AD, the historian Epiphanius still described it as an uninhabited ruin. With the Mouseion devastated, the daughter library housed at the Serapeum, the great temple of the god Serapis, became the primary repository of ancient knowledge remaining in Alexandria. The Serapeum had stood for centuries, a magnificent temple complex on a rocky plateau above the city, dedicated to a deity who blended Egyptian and Greek traditions. Its library, established during the reign of Ptolemy III, held an estimated 42,000 scrolls. Scholars, philosophers, and seekers of wisdom from across the known world still travelled to its colonnaded halls, drawn by both reverence and the quiet promise of learning. The end of the Serapeum came in 391 AD. Emperor Theodosius I had issued sweeping decrees criminalizing all forms of pagan worship throughout the empire. In Alexandria, Bishop Theophilus obtained authority over a temple of Dionysus and converted it into a church. During renovations, sacred pagan artifacts were removed and publicly displayed with contempt, igniting deep anger among the city's pagan community. The confrontation escalated. The Serapeum was seized, stormed, and systematically destroyed. Its statues were smashed, its contents scattered or burned. A Christian church rose on the ruins. The ancient sanctuary was gone. Amid this transformation lived Hypatia of Alexandria, perhaps the last great figure of the ancient Alexandrian scholarly tradition. Daughter of the mathematician Theon, she led the city's Platonic school and delivered public lectures on philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy to students drawn from across the Mediterranean, Christians, pagans, and Jews alike. She wore the traditional philosopher's cloak and walked openly through Alexandria's streets, advising civic officials and citizens. In a city growing ever more fractured along religious lines, her very visibility made her a symbol and, in time, a target. In March of 415 AD, during the season of Lent, a Christian mob seized Hypatia as she travelled through the city. She was dragged into a former pagan temple converted into a church, stripped and killed with terrible violence. Her body was dismembered and burned. The church lector Peter led the attack, and ancient sources point toward the powerful Bishop Cyril as bearing deeper responsibility, though the full truth remains debated by historians. With Hypatia's death, the last publicly prominent philosopher of Alexandria's ancient tradition was gone. The long conversation that had begun beneath the Ptolemies had finally fallen silent. And yet, even after centuries of war, neglect, and religious transformation, one final chapter of Alexandria's ancient story remained. A chapter that would give rise to perhaps the most enduring myth about the library's fate. Chapter 6. What was lost? The enduring mystery and legacy of the vanished library. The story of the Library of Alexandria does not end with fire or conquest. It dissolves slowly, like mist over still water. Modern historians have reached a quiet consensus. The library did not vanish in a single terrible moment. Its decline was gradual, shaped by shifting politics, fading patronage, and the steady drift of scholarly attention away from the city that had once held the world's knowledge. One of history's most enduring legends places the final blow in Arab hands. The tale claims that after Amr ibn al-As conquered Alexandria in 642 AD, Caliph Umar ordered the library's books burned, fuel for the city's bathhouses for 6 months. Yet this story first appeared in Arabic chronicles written 5 centuries after the supposed events, by scholars such as Al-Kifti and Bar Hebraeus, with no earlier source to support it. Contemporary sources from the Arab conquest, Byzantine, Coptic, and Arab alike, record the events of 642 AD in considerable detail, yet not one mentions a library destroyed. Early Christian writers, who would have had every reason to document such barbarism from the new rulers, remained silent. That silence stretching across 5 centuries before the story finally emerged speaks with quiet but unmistakable weight. The legend of the Arab burning emerged during the Crusades era, when anti-Islamic sentiment ran deep. Scholars recognize it as a narrative shaped more by political need than historical truth. The story shifted blame across centuries. Julius Caesar, Christian zealots, Arab conquerors. Each attribution reflecting the anxieties of the age that told it. The library became not a place, but a mirror, reflecting each era's fears about knowledge, civilization, and the threatening other. What truly vanished when the library faded is something far harder to measure than buildings or scrolls. Sophocles wrote more than 120 plays, only 7 survive. Euripides composed nearly 95 tragedies. 19 remain. Of Sappho's 9 volumes of poetry, approximately 10,000 lines of verse, barely 650 lines still exist. Each number carries within it the quiet weight of an entire world that will never speak again. Aristotle's lost dialogues, Eratosthenes' complete geographical writings, the original treatises of the anatomists Herophilus and Erasistratus, works that described the human nervous system, the mechanics of the heart, the circumference of the earth, survive now only in fragments and second-hand references. The full scope, precision, and context of their discoveries dissolved into time, leaving later generations to reconstruct what they could from imperfect echoes. The Babylonian astronomical diaries, the Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa, Persian royal chronicles brought west after Alexander's conquests. The library had gathered the knowledge of entire civilizations within its walls. Non-canonical early Christian texts, the engineering treatises of Heron of Alexandria, the botanical writings of Aristotle, all passed through its halls. What survived did so thinly through scattered citations, Arabic translations, and the patient labor of later scholars. Historians and philosophers have long reflected on what the survival of so much Alexandrian knowledge might have meant. Scholars argue that the systematic, empirical tradition of Hellenistic science, combining geometry, astronomy, medicine, and mechanics, might have accelerated the emergence of the scientific method by centuries. The loss represents not merely missing texts, but paths of human understanding that were never walked, questions that were never asked again for 1,000 years. Archaeological excavations have searched Alexandria for physical traces of the library for more than a century. French, Egyptian, Polish, and Italian teams have uncovered marble foundations, lecture halls, and harbour installations. Yet, the main library building has never been positively identified. In 2023, ground-penetrating radar surveys identified a promising subterranean footprint beneath the modern city, and careful excavations continue, the earth holding its silence still. In 2002, a new library rose beside the ancient harbour. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina, designed by Norwegian architects and opened after years of construction, holds millions of volumes beneath a great circular roof, tilted toward the sky like a rising sun. Its granite walls are carved with scripts from more than 120 languages. It stands not as a replacement for what was lost, but as a continuation of the same ancient human impulse: to gather, to preserve, to illuminate. The deeper lesson the library leaves behind is not one of catastrophe, but of fragility and of responsibility. Knowledge survives only through sustained care, through copying and sharing, through institutions that outlast any single patron or empire. The Library of Alexandria may be gone, but in every library, every university, every moment of quiet human curiosity, something of its spirit endures. A whisper from the ancient world, reminding us that knowledge, once lost, is never truly replaced.